Hi, everyone. My name is Ulka Joshi Hansen. I'm co-interim executive director here at Grantmakers for Education, as well as chief program officer. On behalf of our team and my co-interim director, Beverly Ross-Denny, I want to thank you for joining us today. The release of our benchmarking report is something that our team, especially Rebecca Smith, who's with us today, have been working towards for almost 9 months. And so it was exciting to get it out there. We're excited to share the findings and take questions and hopefully start a bit of a discussion. So we'll get started. I'm just going to share my screen. In terms of format, I'm hoping that we can go through kind of section by section. You are muted right now, but you do have the ability to unmute as we go along. So I'll stop at various points during the presentation to see if folks have clarifying questions. And then at the end, we can sort of go back and answer any big picture questions or kind of scoop up other issues. If you do have questions that you want to drop in the chat, feel free. I will do my best to monitor, and I would ask the Grantmakers for Education team to maybe help push things to the top. And please do use the chat function. I don't think there's another one. So can everyone see my screen? All right, great. So this is the Trends in Education Philanthropy. It's our benchmarking survey, which is a survey that we do every couple of years. And the purpose of this is to provide some insight for the field into where and how education funders are working, what their current priorities and concerns are, and just give us some idea about how the field of education philanthropy is evolving in some key areas, trends in giving, philanthropic practice, as well as sort of high-level trends overall. We've been doing this survey since 2008, and this is the 8th in that series. The survey was administered in late December 2022, and it went through early February of 2023. So at that time, we have a huge database of folks that we sent the survey out to. Some are Grantmakers for Education members, many people are not. We had both quantitative and qualitative responses. So you'll see in the charts that we share, there are some sort of areas and topics and categories that we gave folks. And then there were lots of places throughout to give open-ended responses. And so we coded and did the analysis of all of that data. Sorry, I'm having trouble. All right, so the survey started during the Obama era. And as I'm going to talk about a little bit later, we've seen shifts in how funders are thinking, what their areas of concern are that are related in many ways to the politics and the context of the US and local communities. And this survey is the first one that we've done where we really had a chance to see what's happened as a result of the pandemic and our national kind of attention and focus on racial injustice in the country. And I think you'll see that reflected. We had about 142 grant-making organizations respond. 70% of those, 100, are Ed Funders members. And in terms of the kinds of organizations, we had about 42% of the respondents were family foundations, 23% were independent and private foundations, 9% were community foundations, 8% were collaboratives and intermediary orgs, and then a lot of other different types of charitable institutions. 38% of respondents reported that they work in large urban areas or do a lot of their giving there. 30% said that they focus on rural areas. 28% focus on small to mid-size urban areas. And 44% said that none of those are applicable. So we take that to mean that they fund in either more than one area or that it may be topical. And so they fund more according to that than region. So in terms of some big trends in education philanthropy, there were 3 that we pulled out this year. So the first is a focus on the whole learner, which we had been seeing in past reports. So we did see this in 2018. We saw it in a prior survey in 2015, but for sure we've seen a shift from perhaps what we were seeing in 2008, 2012, and 13, during the Obama era, where there was a focus on standards, on teacher effectiveness, on testing and accountability. we saw a shift over time to a focus on the whole learner. And I want to be clear that that doesn't mean that funders don't care anymore about academics and core academic achievement, but rather I think there's a growing awareness, and the pandemic probably made this even more clear, that there's a need for social and emotional learning, for mental health supports, for out of school time and wraparound supports. As one respondent said, wraparound supports are the backbone of academic achievement, because if students don't have access to basic needs and emotional security, they're not going to be able to thrive academically. In terms of numbers, right, you'll see about 62% of folks say that they're focusing on social and emotional learning. That accounts for about 2% of grant dollars overall. And the same percentage, both of respondents and dollars, are focusing on the mental health and trauma-informed care. Family and community engagement rated really highly, and that has a grant-making share of 8%, which is actually quite high. Community school wraparound supports, think social workers, counseling, housing support, medical support, right? That's how we would define wraparound supports. 58% of funders support those. Student voice and advocacy is really high, which we'll come back to. And out of school time is also a pretty big area. So the anticipated change in funding are some of these graphs on the right-hand side. So, we're looking at folks who are, we're looking at folks, sorry, I keep moving my thing. We're looking at folks who are really anticipating increasing their funding for student voice and advocacy, for mental health and trauma-informed care, intersections between education and other systems, disciplinary policy, restorative justice, and digital literacy. So we're going to come back to a lot of these specific areas as we go into trends in particular parts of their giving. So the second big trend after focus on the whole child is politicization of education. Back in 2018, we had already seen that folks were concerned about kind of the federal policy environment. The last benchmarking report was in the middle of the Trump era, and so there was some concern about politicization, but that tended to be more on the federal level. Today, we're seeing that the federal policy environment in 2018 was considered to be one of the top potential negative factors for education over the next 5 years. That is changing now, where we're seeing about half of respondents saying that they believe that the federal policy environment is very or moderately favorable to their giving areas, though a divided Congress is probably going to make it difficult for a lot of things to get through. Although if you want to look at some of our past webinars, we're doing a series with the Department of Education on many of the areas that they are trying to move things forward with funder support. In 2018, we had about 23% of folks say that the local environment was very favorable. And this year, that share of folks has dropped to 7%. So in other words, only 7% of respondents this year feel like the local context is favorable. And I think that reflects what we're seeing about school board elections and the efforts of local school boards and state legislatures to put limits on curriculum, on history, teaching of history, the CRT debates. So we're seeing all of that, so it's not surprising. So about 55% of respondents say that they are supporting public policy and advocacy at this time. And, it's important. And a lot of folks are saying that they're trying to do a lot more organizing and supporting of students, of families who can really get involved. And then there's a lot of focus on more defensive moves, right? So how do we stop the pushback on what feels like an equity agenda that education philanthropists have been trying to push forward for the last 2.5 decades? How do we kind of make sure that we don't move backwards in the wake of the politicization that's going on? So the last big trend that we wanted to highlight was this idea of education system redesign and transformation. So you'll see on the left-hand side, 68% of respondents say that they fund education system redesign and transformation. And that accounts for 7% of dollars, which is one of the higher areas or higher percentages for any giving area. But there's a little bit of a sort of caveat there. So when you dig into the data, And we looked at three different kind of factors. When you look at how people think about personalized learning, how they think about the role of technology in education, and how they think about the school, and the school being the unit of change. When you look at those three sub-factors, you start to see that how funders and how respondents are defining redesign and transformation is really different. So for some folks, personalized learning is saying, all right, we have curriculum, we have standards. Part of what we're looking for is to help students be able to progress through those curriculum and standards in a way that makes sense for them, right? At a pace that works for them, perhaps in an order. And a lot of those folks also see technology as a way to do that. So how can we use apps? How can we use kind of programs to help teachers personalize the rate or the pace at which students are moving through content? And a lot of those same folks are probably the folks who are looking at schools and thinking about wraparound support. So how do we have schools that are focusing not only on core academics, but also creating the conditions, the climate, the context, and providing the kinds of whole child supports that allow students to thrive. So that's one way that folks are talking about or using this term education system redesign and transformation. There's another set of folks who in their open-ended responses talked about personalized learning more as education should be about individual students' interests, their contexts, sort of culturally relevant, right, in a very particular way. So personalized learning should be about helping education fit who a young person is, not necessarily just taking a look at the standard curriculum. And for those folks, the role of technology is more about opening up opportunities for learning that extend beyond what you can get in the classroom. So how can you use technology? How can you use apps? How can you use virtual reality, for example, in ways that really enhance and allow students to personalize their learning experience? And for those folks, school is not necessarily the unit of change, because they feel as though school and some of the structures that it puts in place around where learning happens, who has to teach, right, that actually limits the ability to move in the direction of personalized learning. So that's an interesting trend. When we get to the end, we're going to talk about some of the big questions that we flagged, but we think given that 44% of respondents said that they're anticipating increasing their focus or their investments in system redesign and transformation, there really is a need to be having a conversation about what exactly we mean by that. And it may be that it means different things. And what does that mean for the kinds of strategies that are supported to kind of move that version of transformation and redesign forward? So I want to pause here for a second just to see if anybody has sort of urgent questions specifically about those three big trends. And then we're going to move into trends that we were seeing in philanthropic practice and education. If you do have a question, feel free to unmute yourself, or if you want to raise your hand, we can sort of call on you. All right. So the second area or the second section or chapter of the report takes a look at findings in terms of trends in philanthropic practice and education. So the big kind of headline is equity is a priority. As I said, I think there's a lot of concern among funders that efforts to push back on equity agendas, whether that means giving students equitable access to resource, access to curricula that are culturally relevant, that are rigorous, that are appropriate for students, ensuring that different students' needs are met, that those efforts to push back on that have arisen in the last 4 to 5 years are potentially a threat. So equity is for sure a priority. That also plays out in who is being funded. So 88% of respondents say that they make funding decisions based on the socioeconomic status of students or the economic status of students and families. 52% say that they make decisions based on race and ethnicity. 28% support girls and women, 21% think about immigration status, and 20% are focusing on boys and men. And then we've got some of the other percentages in the chart. So 68% of folks say that they are actively investing in educational equity. And then what's interesting when you drill down into the question of who has actually translated that commitment to equity into DEI policies and formal DEI policies. 46% of respondents say that they have that kind of a policy that applies to applicants or grantee staff, their grantee staff, their boards, or the populations that are served. 46%, so the same percentage, say they have DEI policies for foundation staff. But only 32% have DEI policies or written DEI policies for their foundation's board. So that'll be interesting to watch to see whether over time there's more of an interest in engaging and kind of formally having policies and potentially accountability for board as well as staff and grantees. So going back to public policy for a second, we talked about the change in the local context. So these are just some of the numbers. You see that about 47% are reporting that we've got a favorable environment at the federal level. 59% say that we have a very favorable or moderately favorable context at the state level. And then you'll see 58% say that we have very favorable or moderately favorable, but just 7% say it's very favorable, which is down from 23% in 2018. So again, this is leading to work and a focus on areas in advocacy, in public policy, or sort of supporting certain types of public policy, as well as, for lack of a better word, defensive tactics, where it's about supporting organizations that are able to focus on narrative change, focusing on organizations that are helping to kind of train, organize, and support young people, families, and communities to kind of push back on these efforts. I duplicated this slide, and that was because this has the title of politicization of education, but I wanted to put it back here because I wanted to show you in the top trends that have the potential for negative impact. You'll see that philanthropy is number 9. And the reason for that were kind of 2 areas, but the most important was power dynamics in grant making. And so really thinking about how grant makers do their work, what they fund. 49% of respondents said that they're exploring or engaging in grant making that's more responsive to partner or community needs. So that could be participatory grant making, trust-based philanthropy, responsive philanthropy. There's a whole suite of things that we've been exploring with folks in our equity and grant making group. But there is a real focus, right, on really thinking about how we think about grant making craft in ways that really help to modulate and moderate those dynamics. So we have folks who said they're working to reduce their application process, moving to having discussions rather than written reports for check-ins, and really engaging the community in the grant review process. There's a focus on how impact is defined and how it's measured. So how do we ask grantees and communities what's important to them rather than imposing it from the outset in terms of foundation priorities? And then hosting office hours once a month to promote transparency and access, so that, you know, potentially folks who may not have the kind of, hey, let's go out to lunch with somebody who works at a foundation, has the ability to come in and have access to foundation staff. So trying to disrupt those traditional imbalances and ways that things operate. The second area that we're seeing a focus on is collaboration. Now, it does remain strong. Funders have talked a lot about wanting to collaborate with other funders, especially as you think about things like politicization, pushing back on anti-equity agendas, thinking about systems redesign and transformation. Lots of respondents indicated that they know that what they want to do and what they want to see is beyond the scope of their one organization. So about 74% of folks say that they're part of learning networks and shared learning spaces. 66% say that they're part of an affinity group of some sort. 54% say they've worked in pooled funding, and 44% say that they're trying to do things like strategic alignment and aligned grant making with other organizations. However, the share of dollars that's being dedicated to collaborative funding is low. It's only about 3%. 3% for about 75% or more of respondents. And less than 5%, right at the bottom, are saying that 53% of their grant-making dollars are being used in this way. So we're seeing a really wide spread. And again, when we get to some of the questions that we think the field could be engaging with moving forward, are questions about what does it mean to collaborate? What does it mean to create the conditions where funders can sort of pool or use their dollars in collective ways in service of larger goals? So the final area, we're just going to dig into trends in education giving. And historically, we focus on kind of 4 areas of early childhood, K-12, post-secondary, and then beyond the classroom, out of school time. So the share of grants, or the share of total grant budgets that are supporting education for respondents, 48% of respondents said 75% or more of their funding goes towards supporting education. And then the smallest percentage of folks, so 8%, said that less than 10% of their grant budgets support education. And then we've got a whole spectrum in between. So we really did have respondents, some of whose primary focus is education, whereas for others, it's a smaller part of their portfolio. And then we've got on the right, 57% of all the respondents said that those dollars, or that percentage of grant dollars, is probably going to remain about the same. And then you've got some folks who are saying it's going to increase. So about 20% of folks say it's going to increase somewhere between 1 and 10%. Which is a good thing to see in terms of us knowing that there's a lot to do in education. So as I said, we have 4 major areas of education. 98% of our respondents focus in K-12 education, 66% focus on post-secondary and career pathways, and we've got different priority areas that we broke down. Out of school time and expanded learning is about 54% of respondents, and 47% say that they focus on early learning. And we're going to dig a little bit more into these percentages. So for early learning, there is an increased focus on early learning. I'll show you a chart in just a second that shows how the percentages of dollars have increased over time. But given the percentage of folks who say that early learning is important, and that trend feels like it makes sense, there's been a lot of push over the last decade and a half, 2 decades, to sort of focus on early years and the importance of them. So 47% of respondents say that early learning is a priority, is important, but the share of grant dollars that are going to support early learning is only 3%, with only about half of respondents saying that they're planning to increase it, with the majority of the rest, so 48%, saying that they're likely to remain about the same. And here you've got the historical comparison. So if you look to the far right at 2015, right, about 40% of folks were providing support for early learning. This year it was 47%, so that's definitely an increase. But you'll see that the percentage of dollars that are being allocated to early learning has gone down from 6% in 2015 to 3% in 2023. That may be because of more investments, and this is just me kind of editorializing here, but that may be because there's more investment at the state and federal level in Head Start and other early childhood programs. But it is interesting to note that even as funders reflect on the importance, they're putting fewer dollars towards it. And again, 50% are saying that they're likely to increase, which is down from a high in 2018. And that's particularly important at this moment, given kind of the impact of the pandemic on the early learning space, both in terms of folks who are professionals and teachers in the space, but also the percentage of programs that had to close or just weren't able to keep their doors open during the pandemic. So moving to K-12 education, kind of 3 big things to note. As I said, there is strong support for educational system redesign and transformation. That's likely to continue to grow. School choice as an area, it's still notable in terms of the percentage of folks who are focusing on it, but it's not attracting new support, which is different from the last couple of reports. And then remote learning is either steady or on the decline, which is interesting and perhaps a reflection of the pandemic and what we learned and what we saw during that time. So just in terms of some of the areas, I'm not going to go through this bit by bit, but we are going to focus in on some of these. We've talked about system redesign and transformation. The majority of teachers are supporting educator preparation, or the majority of funders are supporting teacher preparation and development. There's also a strong focus on literacy and reading skills, multilingual learners. There is interest in new school models and designs, so perhaps kind of dovetailing a little bit with how people are thinking about systems redesign and transformation. STEM and data systems continue to be important. There isn't much investment on technology. So in about a third of respondents were focusing on the use of technology, but it's about 0.2% of overall giving. About a quarter of folks say that they support remote and hybrid learning, but that's only 0.3% of overall dollars. So in general, funders seem to be not investing quite as much in technology, given how technology has changed and has been used over the last several years. The area where respondents seem to agree is digital literacy. So about 30% of respondents say that that is an area that they focus on. It accounts for about 1% of giving. And about 2/5 of folks say that they're likely to increase their investment in that area over time. So again, this is just a chart that gives you a breakdown. I'll keep this up for just a second for folks who are interested. But some of the areas where we're likely to see increase in funding areas are education system redesign transformation, teacher preparation and support, narrative change, right, which I think is tied to that concern about politicization and keeping up with equity issues, civic engagement, civics education, public school finance, and resource inequities is also a growing area of interest and concern, along with literacy and STEM. And then just as a bit of comparison, the share of respondents who say that they're providing support for K-12 education has increased, both in terms of the number of respondents, which is now at 98% versus 82 in 2018. And about 89% of grant dollars are going towards K-12 education, which is up significantly from 2018 when it was 57%. So moving into post-secondary and career pathways, this is a top priority for funders. It's likely to continue growing, but there are some interesting trends that we're seeing. So 58% of folks are, about 2/3 of respondents, just to kind of start at the highest level, say that they support post-secondary education and pathways. But we're going to see in a second that support for alternatives to college is a growing area of interest. But 58% of folks, respondents said that they focus on post-secondary access for historically marginalized students. And 55% say that they have a specific focus on workforce development and career pathway programs. There's also strong concern around post-secondary affordability and improving the financial aid process, a lot of attention on FAFSA, for example. And then there's also a large push to increase a focus on completion. So not only getting students into college or programs, but ensuring that they follow through. And you'll see that, again, access for historically marginalized students and workforce development and the financial aid process are coming up in the top in terms of increases of investments over the next 2 years. So again, you'll see a significant kind of increase over time in the areas where folks were focusing. So in terms of even supporting post-secondary education, it was less than 50% in 2015. Now it's up to 66%. 24% of grant dollars are now being awarded to post-secondary education, and 43% of folks, as I said, are thinking that they're going to continue focus in this area. So 55% of folks, as I said, are providing support for workforce and development programs and career pathways. So that's a 41% increase over 5 years. And that really is in areas, so folks talk specifically about expanding advising for students in middle and high school about alternatives to college. It's a focus on things like trades and credentialing. And then it's kind of in all cases, trying to ensure that students have access to a stable economic future. And so there are considerations about cost of degrees, the amount of debt students are coming in. So all of those are coming up in the post-secondary space. And as I said, a very different conversation than during the Obama era, when there was a real push and a strong push towards four-year college for all. And then our last area is beyond classrooms and schools, which kind of makes up a couple of different areas. So we're seeing an increase in funders embracing the totality of learners' experiences, so that whole child focus, engaging student voice and advocacy specifically. So at this kind of beyond classrooms and schools, we focused on four different areas. So mental health and trauma-informed care, which was an area of strong focus, out of school time program and expanded learning opportunities, intersectional systems. So really thinking about how we're taking into account housing, economic mobility, healthcare, all of those other systems that are not education, but impact students' abilities to learn, and then student voice and advocacy. So you'll see social emotional learning, mental health, trauma-informed care at the top with 62%, along with family and community engagement and community schools and wraparound supports, 57% with student voice and advocacy, 54% of folks say that they're focusing on out of school time and expanded learning, and then 53% with the intersectional issues. And then arts, use of technology, dropout prevention, disconnected youth, all still really important. So the area where we're most likely to see increases in funding over the next 2 years are student voice and advocacy, again, related probably to the concern about politicization and the need for advocacy, but also kind of this need to center communities and to center those who are most impacted by funding as part of the kind of grant-making practice. Mental health supports, intersectionality, disciplinary policy and restorative justice, digital literacy, as we talked about before, and then community supports and wraparounds. All of these areas that we mentioned are likely to continue to increase or at least stay the same. And then again, just some comparisons historically. So again, in 2015, we really didn't have folks providing support for social and emotional learning, and we're at 62% now. So really seeing an upward focus. And as we'll come back to, I think one of the questions for the field is how do we not kind of move this into a competition between core academics and SEL, social emotional learning, mental health supports, but rather kind of seeing them as part of one whole. Again, increase in the proportion of dollars that are being given to social and emotional learning, and anticipating to increase it. That's a little bit lower than what we were seeing in past years, but given how high the percentages of folks who are funding in that area, that's maybe not surprising. And then there's a last area that we focus on strategy. So there is a huge concern or consideration around capacity building. So how do we take existing organizations and models and really increase their ability to do work? That's kind of overlaid with a focus on how do we provide kind of local support to local and BIPOC-led organizations. Folks are focusing on professional development and training, giving general operating and unrestricted support. So again, that strategy in terms of how people or how respondents feel they're going to advance their priorities in the field, but it also dovetails with the considerations around equity and addressing power imbalances. Folks are also convening and doing peer learning, doing advocacy, network building, and collaboration, as well as thinking about how they evaluate programs and organizations. So those are kind of the bigger areas or the stronger areas in terms of how folks are putting their dollars when it comes to what's driving their strategy of giving. And very few, I'll just kind of point it out, is around endowment building and capital support, which again, is just a conversation in the field. So something to watch in subsequent reports. So in terms of the 5 big questions that we put out for the field, actually, I'll pause there. Anybody have questions just about Thank you, Robin, for the question about the grant dollars. Any other questions? And if you want more specifics, Rebecca's amazing at finding data and she's sort of standing by. So if there are specific questions you have, especially about historic things or breakdowns on some of these categories, feel free to drop them in. You can drop them in now or as we go along. All right. So we have 5 questions that we have at the end of the report that we think are going to be shaping the future of education. And this is part of why we do this report. What are the trends we're seeing? What are some of the things we want to keep an eye on as a field? And what can we be doing in the next couple of years to try and both make sense of these trends, but also to dig into areas that feel important? So the first is, we're seeing that respondents are agreeing that there's a need for the education system to kind of be redesigned or to be designed, I suppose, in ways that can holistically and equitably serve learners, especially at a moment of rapid transformation. So the question is, can we articulate a shared vision of the kinds of learning experiences that we want young people to have? And again, one that doesn't pit this kind of whole child social, emotional, mental health, identity formation against core academics and learning. And if we can, what does that mean for how funders need to support things in both the short term and the long term, right? If we really want radical transformation, maybe we need to be defining impacts differently, thinking differently about accountability, thinking about how we're able to measure or count learning that happens in out of school time spaces or extended learning opportunities. So how do we need to think about what it is that we're funding, both in the short and the long term? And then what does that mean for how funders work together with each other, as well as with communities, with government agencies, with families and young people? That's the first big question for the field. The second is, about how the public education system pivots. And I think a lot of folks, again, this is me editorializing, but a lot of the conversation around COVID was, wow, this is going to be a moment for rethinking and redesigning and for something totally different to come in. And the reality is that we've seen things kind of bounce back fairly quickly to be not all that different than they were before the pandemic. So the infrastructure of public education as we have it right now is designed to support the system that we have had for 150, 200 years. So what kinds of systems and policies are going to be needed to help support this forward-facing vision of public education in the public sector? Right? And what do we need to do to build kind of an interest, an appetite, and a capacity for our sector to collaborate on what we talked about as a new public education infrastructure? You can't put in you can't kind of do new things unless you have the systems to support it. And, there are efforts, I think, which is part of the politicization of education. Respondents talked about how they felt like the efforts were about undermining faith in teachers, undermining faith in the public institutions, and taking money out of that system. So as we see efforts to kind of break down the public education infrastructure, what is it that we need to do in response? The third is focusing fully on how states and localities are passing or considering limiting the rights of historically marginalized students, the breadth of perspective that all students are afforded inside the curriculum. So how can funders empower young people, families, communities, and policymakers to protect the rights of all students to receive an education that allows them to be informed, kind of democratic citizens? What is it that we have to do as part of that? The fourth question is, we've got to work in different ways if we want to do different things. So, and respondents talked about their desire to collaborate with others, but that's not something that the education field has historically been doing. So what can we learn from philanthropic work in other sectors and in the global ecosystem? How can we get boards and staffs and grantees involved in developing the skills, developing the relationships, that allow them to shift their policies and move us towards more equitable grant-making processes, not tinkering, but really thinking transformatively about what grant-making can be and what it looks like. And then the fifth question is just around technology, understanding that technology development is going to continue to outpace our capacity to respond. So given that technology is changing the world and changing it at an exponential rate, how do we need to reconsider the mindsets, the skills, and the knowledge that young people need to have as part of their formal learning? How do we use technology as a tool, and a tool that's focused on creating the kind of human-centered, appropriate to what we know about learning science, appropriate to what we know about human development? How can we use technology to help build those kinds of experiences, as opposed to experiences that are perhaps more shallow, but perhaps easier to do? So how can we roll out technology innovation in ways that prioritize the kinds of experiences that we want students to have, and do it in a way that's equitable, both in terms of how we design technology, anti-bias, all of that, but also access and equitable access to technology. So those are 5 kind of big areas and topics for consideration that we pulled out in the report, and would love to just open it up now to all of you. I'm sorry I've been talking at you for 40 minutes, but hopefully with this as a grounding place, would be really interested in your thoughts or what struck you about the data, or your thoughts on any of these 5 questions that we've put out there. All right, we've got about 2 minutes. I definitely want to kind of thank everyone for coming out. I'm just going to let you know that there will be a video of this available within about a week. If you're not signed up for updates and want to get them, you can sign up. And then we've got some upcoming programs related to the benchmarking survey. So tomorrow we have the out of school time bi-monthly funder meetup that'll focus on OST. On June 20th, we're exploring the equity implications of some of the data. So digging deeper specifically around this question of equity, both in education, but also in grant making practice. And then, members, we are happy to come out if you, have a local group and want to bring folks who are not just education funders or just education funders. We're happy to come to you and sort of do a presentation and hopefully maybe have some conversations locally or with groups of funders to kind of make sense of this together and think about how that might impact your work. So you can reach out to programs at Ed Funders for something like that. So thank you all. Happy to stay on for a couple more minutes for folks who have additional questions, but if not, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.